how immensely grateful I am to be here. I really followed my intuition and my trust of Jen in accepting her generous invitation to come. And I find myself sitting here really moved to recognize how much of your work and your thinking has informed my life, and how in so many ways I stand on your shoulders. So thank you. It's really an honor to be here with you. I also need to say that this is the first conference I've ever spoken at where I had to submit an abstract. And for me, because I don't come from an academic background, my graduate school has been 20 years of producing this conference called Bioneers. It was a little intimidating. So I think I selected a topic that was the largest of my expanded thinking, and I have no idea how I could possibly address it all in 20 minutes, but I'll offer some remarks and a story and hope that it may prove useful. Just to introduce myself briefly, my first love growing up was theater, because I understood that the place we most needed to change was the landscape that lay between our ears and that connected our hearts and our minds. And in growing up and producing some rather avant-garde theater at the time, I saw how the direct experience of people witnessing other people's transformation could change them. And so I became really an advocate for story and theater. And then I had a transformative experience when I was about 30. I visited a biodiversity garden that was being cultivated by a master gardener who had studied with indigenous people all over the world. And he had learned that, as indigenous people say, through the seeds speak the voices of the ancestors, and that the most precious gift we can give each other is actually the gift of seeds. And I experienced this garden, which was more beautiful and more bountiful and more of a sensory ecstasy than I had ever experienced in nature before. And through that experience, I felt a call to serve the beauty and fertility and wholeness of the natural world. And that's how I got into producing Bioneers. And Bioneers, for those of you who don't know, is really a community of people from all disciplines and all ethnicities and all walks of life who are dreaming the new world into being. They're really reinventing how we live on Earth and with each other in every single field of endeavor. And I decided that was the community of people that I most wanted to serve. And then in the mid-90s, I saw the film The Burning Times. Some of you may be familiar with it, produced by a Canadian filmmaker in the early 90s, and it totally changed my worldview. And for the first time, I understood that all of the environmental and social crises and challenges that we face, I see as a result of the imbalance between the masculine and the feminine. And so I began committing myself to this reemergence of the feminine and restoring myself along the way, and learning how, even though the world saw me as an accomplished woman leader, I didn't see myself that way at all. And so I began unpacking my own stories and learning how to cultivate myself to step into my own sense of purpose and authority. And then translating what I was learning into teaching and experiences for other women. And like Paula, I'm afraid. And I'm also incredibly inspired and feel like I'm on fire. I'm afraid for the natural systems and the earth, our mother who holds us. I'm afraid for whether we as a species can awaken in time to shift enough of our systems and be resilient enough so that the new world that we're all midwifing into being can sustain us through the damage and change and destruction that I think is ahead. So The environmental movement in North America, anyway, has historically been perceived as predominantly white, privileged, and male, and as valuing endangered species and habitat more than people. But with the accelerated impacts of global warming, resource depletion, and increased toxicity, meeting with overpopulation, gender inequities, income disparities, and tribal warfare, that reductionist rift is not one that we can afford to perpetuate. It's a manifestation of a core conceptual dichotomy and a myth of false separation, because of course, as human beings, we are a part of nature, not apart from her. To expand on the baseball metaphor that's often used, nature not only bats last, but actually we're on her playing field in a game that has rules of her own invention. And as we all know, we ignore them at our peril. So part of my learning from pioneers has been to understand that as I learn about the Earth's biology, I find metaphors and lessons for how we as people can live now in this time of transition. And the Earth, of course, is a closed-loop system, which means that, you know, the coffee or tea we're drinking right now might have once been Cleopatra's bathwater. We're all breathing and drinking and living in each other's molecular soup all the time. So this notion of false separation and the reductionist world that we have all been raised through this patriarchal system, you know, is obviously incredibly destructive. And that biological reality offers an embodied metaphor to the spiritual perspective that we are one. As Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King so eloquently put it, we are linked in cycles of inescapable mutuality, and no amount of privilege or gated community will shield anyone from the environmental and health impacts of our actions. And as women are very often the first to understand, and many indigenous cultures embody implicitly, our relationships to ourselves, each other, and the earth are all octaves of the same societal disease or imbalance. They're all inextricably linked, symbiotic, and interrelated. And we cannot heal one without transforming them all. And since the reinvention of our civilization requires far more than a technical fix, and at its core really requires a change of heart and a change of worldview, I suggest that stories are a really powerful tool for accelerating the changes that we know are needed. Stories are medicine for our false isolation. They're a way to forge connection and community and help shift our course. N. Scott Momaday said, "We live in a house made of stories." They are the seed forms of culture we carry around within us, and they define how expansively or how tightly we offer the gift of ourselves to this ailing world. We decide how far we can go, how large a stand we're willing to make, or what risks we're willing to take based upon the stories we tell ourselves. Sometimes, of course, they stem from our family and social conditioning, and we carry them unwittingly, unaware of how they shape our lives. Cognitive linguists are noting how we humans are hardwired for story. They've shown how once we've wrapped our minds and hearts around a story, no amount of facts that contradict the story will cause us to change it. And as we're here to consider the gift economy and how women are re-envisioning economics, I want to mention Donna Morton, who runs the Center for Integral Economics in BC. And she noted that though economics tries to position itself as a science, in fact, it's really a series of stories. And the good news is that, like any story, we have the capacity and the power to change it. And to reinvent our economic systems based on what we actually value. As we spread a story based on gratitude, generosity, and sufficiency, rather than one of scarcity, competition, and inadequacy, that will help us shift the mindset that plagues our civilization. If we can recognize that by prioritizing one variable in this complex living system, by prizing money above any other value of life, we've thrown the whole system into tilt, we'll be closer to shifting our collective course. In the sciences, women are following Rachel Carson's courageous lead to consider whole systems and not just reductionist, mechanistic parts. Women are leading in the fields of biomimicry and green chemistry, learning from nature how to work with nature. In education, there are great shifts towards ecological literacy, with children really being taught where their food comes from and how to grow it and how to prepare it. There's a great quote by the Austrian physicist Fritjof Capra that I refer to a lot, where he says, "The transition to an eco-literate society requires a shift in focus from counting things to mapping relationship." And of course, you know, as products of a culture that doesn't know how to value mapping relationship, this shift from quantifying to qualifying is part of the great transition, the great turning that we're all navigating right now, and that everyone in this room is a part of helping us see the way to shift our course. In environmental health, women, and especially Indigenous women, are mapping the relationships between corporate toxicity and their communities' both social health and physical health. When we share stories, they offer us insight to empathically imagine what an other is thinking or feeling. They encourage compassion between people who are different. When they are offered with honesty, heart, and courage, they can change us. As we spread them, they can shift our culture. Few things create connection more meaningfully than listening deeply to each other's stories. Most of us yearn for intimacy and deep relationship. My father used to say it was the measure of a life well lived to see how many people we had allowed how intimately to really see us. The first thing babies do when they're born is to raise their arms to be held. Some say it's also the last thing people do as they're dying, is to feebly attempt to raise their arms. And when I learned of the grandmother who died with the hands of her family placed tenderly all around her body, their voices lifted in song for her to ride upon as she transitioned from this world to the next, I wept for wanting that when my time comes. In an anti-racism training for white facilitators that I took, I learned about Dr. Martin Luther King's vision of beloved community. He envisioned an interrelatedness, a kinship among people of all ethnicities, classes, spiritual beliefs, and tribes. His vision offered the way that it was deeply moved and inspired me, and my own commitment deepened. My beloved community includes all the whales and the sea turtles and the salmon, the egrets, the crows, the otters, and bears. It encompasses all the creatures and plants, the oceans, mountains, rivers, and fungi, all of which are needed and all of which I consider sacred. We're all indigenous to someplace and have community embedded in our cellular and ancestral memory. In some deep corner of our hearts, don't we all yearn for it? But in a quest for certainty, seeking an illusion of safety, criticism and judgments reinforce our separateness. The invisible stories embedded through our culture lead us to ruthlessly rank ourselves and each other, hardening our hearts to empathic connection. In closing, I want to share a story about something that happened to me this summer at a Cultivating Women's Leadership training that I co-led. Our time together included a collective dive into the pain of racial wounding in the US. We heard about the Chinese grandmother whose bound feet hurt so badly she had to be carried, and the great uncle who'd been lynched to death in the South. We heard about the Peruvian indigenous grandmother who'd been forced from her ancestral lands, and the woman of mixed ancestry who had grown up ashamed to be the darkest of her siblings. We listened deeply and held each other tenderly. We named positive associations for black and darkness to reclaim their value. We collaborated to create embodied healing rituals. On the last night, my training partner and I were awoken at 3 a.m. One of the women, a black woman, was having an asthma attack and had forgotten to bring her inhaler. We rushed to her room, uncertain of what to do. We were at a retreat site in northern New Mexico, and we were very far from a hotel or any medical attention. Arriving at her room, I felt her panic, gasping for breath, trying to fill her lungs, and I saw the terror in her eyes. My mind had no previous experience and was no help at all. So I dropped into a place where I could feel my body's instructions.